A very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for finding time to being with us today. A minute past 3 p.m. here in Nairobi. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you're tuned in and watching us from here at the latest news from across the continent of Africa. Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki says the East African Regional Grouping, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development IGAD, should be given priority in resolving the ongoing crisis in Sudan. He says that while the current situation in Sudan is a matter of global concern and individual countries may express their interest, the IGAD's initiative can assist the Sudanese people to transition to a new political disposition that aligns with their aspirations. The president said there was an urgent need for the tragic and deplorable conflict in Sudan to come to an immediate end, and for there to be an unitary defense and security organ in the country. He says Eritrea is willing to provide its best assistance to address the crisis in Sudan, but the people should also be allowed to address their challenges independently. Mr. Isaias said Eritrean sea, land borders, as well as its airspace were open for Sudanese and others affected by the current conflict. He, however, insisted that Eritrea was not willing to establish refugee shops, but was willing to provide modest assistance to the Sudanese people. He said that the ongoing conflict was the result of the military leaders engaged in a power struggle without fulfilling their responsibility to ensure a peaceful transition to an elected government. A Ugandan National Army soldier has shot and killed a government minister whom he was guarding. Retired Colonel Charles Okello Engola, the Deputy Minister for Labour, was shot at his home in the capital Kampala Tuesday morning. It is not yet clear whether there was an argument between the soldier and his boss. Some eyewitnesses say the soldier walked around the neighborhood shooting in the air. The soldier, who is yet to be officially identified, then shot himself dead minutes later. Reports say a number of people were injured in the incident. Videos on social media shows a local gathering at the scene in shock. Colonel Engola had previously served as a Deputy Minister for Defense. The World Food Programme has said that it has resumed its operations in Sudan as the fighting in the country threatens millions with hunger. In a statement on Monday, the UN agency said distribution of food is expected to commence in the states of Gedaref, Gezira, Kassala and White Nile in the coming days. The World Food Programme suspended operations when 3 staff members were killed on the first day of the conflict between Sudan's army and paramilitary Rapid Support Forces RSF. The agency noted that over 15 people were already facing severe food insecurity in Sudan before the outbreak of conflict, and these numbers are expected to increase significantly as the fighting continues. Meanwhile, United Nations Emergency Relief Coordinator Martin Griffiths is expected to arrive in Sudan today to assess the humanitarian situation in the country. The Japanese Prime Minister Kishida Fumio arrived in Ghana on Monday on the second leg of the African tour. Fumio met Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo and both vowed to continue to pursue reforms at the United Nations Security Council. Japan and Ghana are serving as non-permanent members of the Security Council. The Ghanaian president added that the current Security Council permanent members does not reflect the current reality, adding that reform must be promoted. Both heads of state also agreed to closely coordinate on the issue of Sudan, where military clashes continue for a third week. The Japanese Prime Minister said he hopes his latest visit will boost cooperation between the two countries across a range of fields such as the economy, development and human resources. Head over to Senegal. And the main opposition leader, Ousmane Sonko, has called for national civil disobedience against the judiciary and further rejected any dialogue against President Macky Sall. Sonko, on the other hand, denounced claims that he was undermining the justice system. Sonko last month had claimed his life was in danger and that he had evidence showing he was to be assassinated on March the 16th on his way to court to face charges of rape allegations. Another court on 30th of March gave opposition politician Sonko a 2-month suspended prison sentence for defaming a minister. The opponent, who came third in the presidential election in 2019, and his supporters claim that the judiciary is being used by the government to eliminate him politically and clear the way for the incumbent Macky Sall. Sonko and his supporters accused the government of using the justice system to prevent him from running for president in February 2024. The presidential party accuses Mr. Sonko of wanting to paralyze the country and of using the street to escape justice. Several human rights organizations have expressed concern about the climate of tension in the country, restrictions on freedoms of assembly and expression, and have called on President Sall to abandon his third term, albeit as he has left it unclear whether he will run for in 2024. And back in the country, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida is expected in Kenya today as part of the four-leg African tour, his first since he became the Asian country's head of government 2 years ago. A tentative itinerary released by his office said he was coming to Nairobi, Sub-Sahara's largest recipient of Japan's official development assistance, ODA, to see cooperation on a number of global crises, including that in Sudan and Ukraine. The Japanese leader had already visited Egypt as well as Ghana from Saturday, and his trip will also take him to Mozambique. He is expected to hold a summit with Kenya's President William Ruto to discuss economic cooperation as well. They will also mark 60 years of cooperation. Japan established diplomatic relations with Kenya shortly after Nairobi's independence and set up on an embassy in 1964. Kenya responded by setting up one in Tokyo in 1979. Kishida will be the first Japanese prime minister to visit Kenya since 2016, and Shinzo Abe visited for the Tokyo International Conference on Africa Development, TICAD. Last year, Kishida had told African leaders of Japan's desire to front itself as a partner growing together with Africa. Britain on Monday said it was exploring options to provide humanitarian assistance to Sudan in coordination with its international allies, the United Nations and NGOs, after a large scale of evacuation of its citizens from the northeastern African country. A total of 2,197 people had been evacuated from Sudan as of 4:30 British time. The government said in a statement, adding that it has set up a team at Port Sudan to provide consular assistance to Britons, including those leaving by commercial routes. The tally could increase as further flights carrying British nationals and others, including Sudanese doctors working in Britain's state-run National Health Services, were expected from Port Sudan in the evening. Britain's International Development Minister Andrew Michel met Kenyan President William Ruto and African Union Chairperson Musa Faki Mohamed in Nairobi over the weekend to discuss the conflict, the government said. Countries around the world conducted one of the biggest international evacuations in years last week, following the sudden outbreak of fighting in Sudan, with the UN estimating on Monday that 800,000 people might flee the country due to the conflict. And hundreds of Moroccan trade union activists rallied in the capital, Rabat, on Monday to protest against declining purchasing power, soaring inflation, and rocketing food prices. The unions are demanding, among other things, a ceiling on fuel prices, a reduction in taxes on basic products, and a reduction in income tax to support purchasing power. Abdel Hamidine, a member of the General Secretariat of Justice and Development Party, added that yesterday they were demanding social justice, freedom, and reorganization of the socio-economic conditions in Morocco, given that they are facing a very serious situation. Inflation in Morocco has hit 8.2% in March, including a 16.1% rise in food prices, according to official statistics. The agricultural sector, which is crucial to Moroccan economy, is also facing a chronic rainfall deficit, which is further straining the food prices. Back to Ethiopia, and the military budget rose biggest last year. I apologize for that. Ethiopia's military budget rose biggest last year as the country battled the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, indicating an added cost of the 2-year war with the rebel. It has since signed a peace deal, and the revelation mean Addis Ababa is Eastern Africa's king of military spending after the country's expenditure on soft and hardware rose by 88% during the 2022 to reach $1 billion. The figures are contained in the latest bulletin by global security think tank Stockholm International Peace Research Institute that is based in Sweden. It says Ethiopia recorded the largest annual percentage increase in military spending of any country in Africa, even though that the continent spent on military and arms purchases overall decreased during the year under review. The report released in April 2023 explains that Ethiopia's massive spend coincided with the country's renewed government offensive against the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF. Besides the costly war against the TPLF that began in November 2020, Ethiopia also deployed part of its troops to Somalia as part of the African Union peacekeeping force known as the African Union Transition Mission, that is the ATMIS. ATMIS spending is often on troop contributing countries' defense budget, after which the UN reimburses the countries on equipment used in the war, while donors support the administrative and welfare expenditure of the troops. Despite also deploying in conflict beyond their borders, Uganda and Kenya, the region's big spenders on firepower and conflict materials are not mentioned in this report, indicating that the two last year, that is Uganda and Kenya, reduced their appetite for top sport in the arms race. Staying with Kenya, the leader of a Kenyan cult group and 6 others have been rearrested minutes after a court in Malindi released them. Magistrate Ivy Wasike freed Paul Nthenge Mackenzie and his suspected accomplices after an application by the prosecution to close the case. State Prosecutor Vivian Kabanga said she wanted them to be tried in another court on charges that will include terrorism. They have been driven to neighboring Mombasa County, which is farther south along the coast. They were initially charged with murder, radicalization, and threatening public safety after more than 100 followers of the cult group were found in mass graves last month. Mr. Mackenzie, the leader of the group, was accused of encouraging them to starve themselves to death. He denies any wrongdoing. A post-mortem report showed that some of the victims were also killed through suffocation and strangulation. Okay, so the good pastor, I guess, have some card answers there to answer, some very tough questions there to answer, and which is a matter that is under investigation, so I will not talk about it. Even I think the president alluded to wanting to form a commission of inquiry, a matter that has really attracted a lot of debate in the Kenyan public. But I'll just leave that there. That is a matter in front of the court, but it is, of course, something that has not just shocked us Kenyans here, but that the shock has reverberated across the world. Now, see the amount of money. I keep telling us here, the price tag of war is astronomers. And for Ethiopia, it even became much bigger. It spent so much of its budget from 2020, 2021, especially 2022, on acquiring acquiring new military equipments. So the budget rose. The military budget rose last year during the fight with the TPLF, between the government forces and the TPLF. And this is so much. If you even just sat down and just calculated this amount of money and what that could mean in terms of some other important things that perhaps that money could have been used in doing in the service of people of Ethiopia, then you will understand why some of these conflicts, if we can avoid them, then it is prudent that we absolutely avoid them. If we really don't have to fight, if we can have a conversation and negotiate and just listen to one another and allow more room for dialogue and open up spaces for communications, if we could just embrace that as the first step towards conflict resolution, I think that can go a long way in saving these fragile economies in the continent. We keep pumping more money in military allocation, getting more arms. And for Ethiopia's case, it's very sad. You're procuring more arms to fight your own people. And then now, these people were killed. A lot of destruction happened. This money that was allocated for the budget in support of that conflict would have gone a long way in building more schools, in perhaps enabling more piped water, in enhancing electrification. Now that you have the Great Renaissance Dam, the Great Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, that has brought you problems with Egypt, that money could have been used to electrify the villages and areas that are still not able to don't have access to electricity. That money could have been used to do other things, to support farming, agriculture, to support a health sector that is ailing, especially just after coming from COVID-19. Countries are reeling. We don't have that much money now to spare and spend on a war, fighting our own people. Please make that make sense to me. Because the conflict in Ethiopia was within Ethiopians, okay? And these Ethiopians were just in disagreement on how they need to operate and govern within themselves and get along in the political sphere. And a bit of ethnicity undertones were also there. But these are not people who are fighting to form another country. These are not people who are fighting to leave Ethiopia. These are people who are fighting to find a solution, a political solution, within some things that they disagreed upon, surely. It's not always prudent to take up arms, especially if you look at the price tag. How much did they spend again? This revelation means Addis Ababa is Eastern Africa's king of military spending after the country's expenditure on soft and hardware rose by 88%. Can you imagine? On top of whatever it is that it spends on its annual budget, that rose by 88% during 2022 to reach $1 billion. Do your calculations. Do your calculations and you will understand why an armed conflict is a zero-sum game. The end of the day, nobody gets to win. This money would have been used in other things. This money would have gone a long way in alleviating the hunger that is being experienced from the poor climatic conditions, the parts of Ethiopia suffering from, Somalia is suffering from, parts of Kenya is suffering from, even Uganda this time, parts of Uganda was suffering from, lack of food. So this money would have been distributed in areas that the people of Ethiopia actually get to benefit. But no, we couldn't just help ourselves. We couldn't just sit down and have talks like the government is doing now with the OLA. What was so difficult for Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed to take up the leadership earlier on before the TPLF, before the government and the TPLF's, disagreement was aggravated to the levels that now it became an armed conflict. What was the problem then? See now what you're doing in Tanzania, the talks between the government forces, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is being represented and the Oromo Liberation Army. The talks are ongoing. Now there's another group here that also needs to have similar talks with the government. That is the Amara. Because Amara also is another region or also another people that feels they have issues and there are some, I don't know if it's systematic problems that they're having with the government of Ethiopia, but they seems to be having some problems. And they need the attention of the government. And that is why I was saying, see, as much as these issues are different and maybe these regions have different, problems that they might need to have an audience with the government. When these talks, the talks between the government and the TPLF was taking place in South Africa, later on the other phase of the talks came into Kenya and they're still continuing because they're still working on certain issues, but I think it's going on very well. My thoughts at that time was, now that we have agreed to open up some talking space and the government has agreed to mediation, why don't we bring everybody to the table? Why don't we have TPLF sit represented over there, and then we have the OLA seated someplace? The Mara people who seems also to be having these problems, whatever it is, let them have a seat someplace, and then anybody else that feels they're having a problem, so that we could just have one big mediation happening, because these are the same people. The difference between Ethiopia and these many other conflicts that we have in this continent is the issues are not very hard to address. And these are people who love their country. These are people who just want to be heard in their country. These are people who just want to be included in the daily running of their country. And so there were some differences, others historical, others ethnical, others, dates a while back. But we have seen what talks can do. We have seen that, talks can actually bring us to a solution that we don't have to pay the price tag that we've seen that was paid in the conflict between the TPLF and the government. Over 600,000 people died. As we sit here and congratulate that process and say it is going on very well, nobody is addressing that issue. People died, over 600,000. These are figures that are out there. The government has not even disputed these figures. The first time, I think they were thrown around by Olusegun Obasanjo, and then Ethiopian Human Rights Commission came out and said, you know what, it could be between 100,000 to 1 million. So somewhere in there. So let's just say it's over 600,000. People died. People died. People who should not have died. People whose deaths would have been avoided. Okay? And now you see the government invested so much. Its military spending went up to more than 88%. I'd love to hear the budget on education going up to more than 88%. I'd love to hear the budget on healthcare, public healthcare, going up to over 88%. We spend so much on military, on weapons, on things that we use to hurt each other with, than we do on the issues and on the things that we can use to equip our people, to enable our people, to create an enabling environment, to ensure that there's efficiency in how public services run. We don't spend money in that. We don't spend time in that. We don't allocate enough funds. But anything that goes towards, military and fighting the same people, then now we up the budget with 88%. This should be a lesson. And it's not like Ethiopia has that much money. It is not. I do understand the economy is doing relatively well compared to some other countries, but still, it does not have the luxury of spending this much money on unnecessary conflict. So is any other country in Africa. The price tag of war is too high. The only people who benefit are the people who manufacture these weapons, because we keep buying. We keep keeping these industries going on, this industries from the West. Those are the only people who benefit from this conflict. But we get to lose. The government of Ethiopia gets to lose, because now, after spending all this money in acquiring all this military, whatever it needed, now it has to spend more money in rebuilding the areas that it helped destroy. It has to rebuild back the hospitals that it was airbombing. It has to rebuild back the roads that were destroyed. It will take years, a lot of years of rebuilding. And let's not even get into the human aspect of it, and how much perhaps therapy and how much trauma those people who experienced all these atrocities going on and who survived and are able to tell the story today. That is just another aspect that we can't even quantify. We can't put a price on that. So sometimes, and maybe the government of Abiy Ahmed land, because now we see how they're handling the OLA. They tried with some hard power there. It did not work well, and I think Abiy Ahmed did a very quick calculation, and he thought, we can't keep upping this military spending to keep fighting our people. I think the best way is just have people, have them come to the table, and let's talk as Ethiopians and find our solution moving forward. So while you do that, can you have the Amaras also come on the table? Can you have all these people that seems to be having problems? Can you have them so that you can have one mediation, and you can iron out issues, and you can see how you can solve these problems? Once you are able to talk, you realized the issues that were being raised are things that you could work through, and within no time, a resolution was reached. And now you've started implementing, and both sides have shown some good faith in implementing the outcomes of the mediation process. But it's working well. So let's have everybody on the table. Let's have the Amaras. Let's have, now that you have the OLA and others who feel that they want to be heard. I think it will be important, Prime Minister Abiy, before you get to up another military spending, which is unnecessary, over $1 billion. $1 billion investing in things that are only going to hurt you people. 1 billion investment. 1 billion. Can you imagine that? On a military equipment meant to fight your own people. Well, you could just talk to your people. You could just talk within yourselves and find a solution. Come on now. Okay. All right. Let's leave that there. Now, Japan Prime Minister, I think he's in Kenya now. He's expected to be arriving here. Maybe not. He was in the morning I was telling you he was in Ghana. And he's coming to Kenya, and then he'll be heading to Mozambique. And I think a country like Japan, owing to how we have been seeing them and the positions they've been taking in the international system, I think this is a country I want to hear more of its position, more of its opinion, more of its voice. I think Japan is just one of those countries whose voice is very important in this international system. Because unlike any other players, the US, EU, Russia, China, their interests are really vested. I'm not saying Japan does not have vested interest. It does have in Africa. But it's not obsessed with the international power struggles like we see, jostling of powers between these states and all that. Japan does not want to replace anybody in the international system. I think after they lost in the World War II and the US was left standing, I think years later, I think Japan is just one of those countries that you can look at as that has embraced peace. And even remember when the former Prime Minister Abiy, not Abiy Ahmed, Shinzo Abe was shot last year. It was a shock to the world because you never hear of any kind of gun violence and things like that. So whatever shot Shinzo Abe was actually from a science experiment, because this guy could not walk in any shop and buy a gun. Unlike countries like the US, unlike countries like the UK, Europe, where violence is just the order of the day. They think we have issues here, and they issue these travel alerts over security matters in Africa, but over there, you'll be lucky to leave your house, go shopping, and come back and still be alive if, one, you're a certain race, and two, if you live in certain neighborhoods. Okay? But Japan, those cases are so rare. So even the shooting of former Prime Minister, I don't know why I keep saying Abiy Ahmed, because I think I've talked about him so much, of Shinzo Abe, was quite a shock to the world. And you can see it's a country with very strong values. Look at how they carried themselves during the World Cup. I think the rest of the world fell in love with Japan and what they stand for and what they represent. So I think Japan's voice is just one of those voices that we don't hear enough of in the international system. And I think it's about time that Japan perhaps took up these positions of mediation, these positions of voice of reason, these positions of just calming the whole system down, because how it is being run right now with those top dogs, it's not doing the rest of us any good. So he is on a a four-leg African tour. He was started with Egypt. The new Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, he started with a visit in Egypt, and then he went to Accra, Ghana. He's in Kenya. He's about to arrive, or he has arrived. I'm not sure, but he will be in Kenya today, and then he'll be heading over to Mozambique. So I think this is quite important, and I would like to see Japan take up that role quite often. So Kishida will be the first Japanese prime minister to visit Kenya since 2016, when Shinzo Abe visited for the Tokyo International Conference on Africa Development. Last year, Kishida had told African leaders of Japan's desire to front itself as a partner growing together with Africa. I can believe that. Of course, they're looking out for their own interest, and the issue of foreign policy, and and things like that. But I don't know. Japan seems to be of the partners that we have, and developmental partners that we have from outside of. I think Japan saying that it wants to be a partner growing together with Africa, I can believe that. Of course, that is not entirely true. They're looking out for their own interests. But still, I think this is a relationship that Africa can benefit from. Okay, this is a lesser evil compared to perhaps the other countries, because the way they're coming for Africa, and the way they're coming after Africa's wealth, and the way they're looking for Africa's attention, be it the US, be it Russia, be it China, be it EU, be it all these players, they're so aggressive, and that is because their interest is at stake, okay? And they stand to lose or gain so much, depending on how African countries chooses to associate with them. But I think on Japan, I don't know, perhaps it's a lesser evil. And also, I think Japan is, as like I've said, I think this is a very important voice that we don't hear enough of in the international system. And I think Japan, looking at how they carry themselves and how they operate, and whatever, I think that Japan's voice is really, really needed. And something that he said when he was in Ghana, the Prime Minister Kishida Fumio, when he was in Ghana, they were having a press conference together with President Nana Akufo-Addo, and he vowed to continue to pursue reforms at the United Nations Security Council. Japan is not a member of the United Nations Security Council, so I think they're feeling the way we are feeling. Like, why is Japan not at the United Nations Security Council, first of all? We need a country like Japan at the United Nations Security Council. We need that. And like I said, we need a voice of reason up there. And then he's saying he'll be supporting Kenya, Africa's position, because several leaders have been calling for this. And the latest one is President Paul Kagame. I think last year there was a meeting, and he reiterated that position that had also been expressed before, but the late president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, and Gaddafi, and other few leaders who have had the guts to stand out and say, no, Africa, we are not being treated right. And I think this population has grown enough, and I think Africa is a very important player in the international system, so it's about time that we were given a permanent position at the United Nations Security Council. And anyway, it's a long history, even how the 5 members were formed. Initially, they were the ones who had the nuclear power. So I think them being part of the United Nations Security Council is just a form of, a power balance, okay? So they collected the countries that owned the nuclear power at that time. And, they initially made up the United Nations Security Council, the permanent members. And that was just a form of a balance of power. So that if we all have the nuclear power, so I think we can threaten each other here. But we've seen how that has played out, among other reasons why, we have the United Nations is set up as it is. But I think it's about time that we have these reforms. It's about time we have these reforms at the United Nations Security Council. And I think Japan is saying it is supporting Africa's position on that. But the thing is, well, Africa waits for somebody to come and offer it this position. That is not going to happen. African countries should decide we are not attending the United Nations General Assembly. They should decide. They should just take some stance. And that way, maybe the world respect us. Okay, and maybe we can see these reforms, but just sitting and waiting and hoping that these reforms will take place, that will never happen. The way that system has been crafted is meant to leave us where we are. The global south, stay as you are. We're going to manage your development. We're going to manage, how things are run, and we're going to set the standards for you. That is the global south, and set the pace and set the agenda and all that. And the rest of us just have to dance to that tune. And that is how that system has been set. So unless we really are brave enough to upset that system, it is a system. So unless we're brave enough and we have courage enough to say, you know what, enough is enough. I think we are going to have our dignity back. And I think this system, the way it has been set up, is not working for us. And because of that, until and unless there are reforms, then we are not willing participants and take that position. That is the only way we might see some change at the United Nations Security Council. But just threatening and issuing these statements, and then the next General Assembly, we're running there with a huge entourage, more than anybody else, then nothing will change. Things will continue to stay the same, okay? But I think these are conversations that we should continue having, because indeed, change is needed and is absolutely necessary. The rest of the stories I'll catch up as with tomorrow, God willing. I want to thank you so much for your time this afternoon. This has been Diaspora Dispatches. My name is Miriam Magutu. Enjoy the rest of your day and please keep safe. Bye-bye.